Chapter 11: Che's Diary and Hidden Remains. Following Che's capture and execution, the Barrientos government decided to sell Che's diary to the publisher willing to pay the highest price. The information in this chapter is based on the author's original research. See Harris 2007, 227-56. However, while the Bolivians were negotiating the sale of the diary, the Cuban government mysteriously obtained a copy and released it through publishing houses in Latin America, Europe, and the United States. By publishing the diary before the Bolivians could sell it, the Cuban government was able to score a significant propaganda victory and greatly embarrass the Barrientos regime. Moreover, the questions about how the Cubans got a copy of the diary gave rise to serious doubts in Bolivia about the integrity of the government and the armed forces. Clearly, someone in the civilian side of the government or the military had placed a copy of this top-secret document in the hands of the Cuban government. Che's diary was made public in Havana on July 1, 1968, shortly after I had arrived in La Paz, and within a few days it was distributed by leftist publishers in Chile, Mexico, France, Italy, West Germany, and the United States. A few weeks later, on July 17, Antonio Arguedas, Minister of the Interior and a close friend of President Barrientos, fled to Chile, and 180 CheGuevara was denounced by General Ovando as the traitor who had provided the Cuban government with photographic copies of Che's diary. The Bolivian public was stunned by the news, and most of the population regarded Arguedas's actions as a national disgrace. Since Arguedas had been President Barrientos's right-hand man, the whole affair seriously undermined the public's confidence in the Barrientos regime, and within 24 hours plunged the country into a grave political crisis that broke apart the coalition of political parties that had previously supported Barrientos. At the same time, the three main opposition parties, the right-wing Socialist Phalange, the centrist National Revolutionary Movement, and the Trotskyist Revolutionary Party of the Nationalist Left, issued a manifesto calling on the Barrientos government to resign. They also called a mass demonstration in the capital on July 20, which resulted in a violent clash with the police and the death of a captain of the civil guard. The leaders of the demonstration were arrested, and Barrientos declared a nationwide state of emergency. He also called on the peasant syndicates in the Cochabamba area to come to his assistance, and 5,000 armed campesinos from the Cochabamba Valley were mobilized and moved to the outskirts of La Paz. This appears to have been the turning point in the crisis. Soon thereafter, Barrientos received expressions of public support from the various military garrisons throughout the country, as well as several important political groups. Ironically, the crisis arising from the publication of Che's diary, and particularly Arguedas's part in the whole affair, almost toppled the Barrientos regime, something Che's guerrilla operation never came close to achieving while he was alive. But the Arguedas affair did not end there. Much to everyone's surprise, approximately a month after his flight from the country, Antonio Arguedas voluntarily returned to Bolivia to stand trial for his actions. In Chile, Arguedas had publicly declared that he wanted to return to Bolivia to clear his name. However, most Bolivians assumed he had received a large sum of money from the Cubans in return for Che's diary, so no one took seriously his announced intention to return home. This made it all the more surprising when he did return to Bolivia, following a month-long odyssey that took him to Buenos Aires, Madrid, London, New York, and Lima, before arriving back in La Paz. Che's Diary and Hidden Remains 181. When he arrived in Bolivia, Arguedas told the press that he had returned in order to clear his conscience and face the consequences of his past actions. His exact words to the Bolivian press were the following: "I am not looking for publicity. I only want to tell the truth about everything that occurred in my career as a subsecretary and minister of government, and alert not only the present government of Bolivia, but all the governments of Latin America as to how North American imperialism undermines their intelligence services in order to introduce errors, to distort, to present a completely different picture of reality, to obstruct their economic relations with other states, and finally, to keep them under its control." He said he had returned in order to regain his personal dignity by telling the truth at the moment when it was most appropriate to do so. In this regard, he reminded the reporters he had been the favorite of both the Americans and the most reactionary political elements in Bolivia prior to his sending Che's diary to Fidel Castro, and that he had given up a promising political career because of his disgust over the undermining of Bolivia's national sovereignty by U.S. political and economic interests. At the press conference following his return to Bolivia, Arguedas refuted the suggestion that he had given a copy of Che's diary to Fidel Castro because he was a Castroite or because he was a communist. He denied being either a Castroite or a communist and stated that he was a nationalist RSD and a Marxist second. With regard to the accusation that he had received a large sum of money for the diary, Arguedas angrily retorted that this was another of the CIA's insidious attempts to discredit him by slander. He argued that if it had been money he was after, it would have been unnecessary for him to sell Che's diary to the Cubans. Arguedas pointed out that as Minister of Internal Affairs, he could have made a fortune in bribes from the Americans if he had wanted to do so. He said he had documents hidden outside the country that, among other things, proved that a U.S. engineering firm, which he named, had offered him a bribe of $1.5 million to see that they were awarded a government contract for the construction of 2 new highways. In other words, he argued that he had rejected bribes of much greater amounts than the $500,000 it was rumored he had received from the Cubans for the diary. 182. CheGuevara. The Arguedas affair is one consequence of Che's guerrilla operation that Che himself could never have foreseen. Arguedas's actions shook the Barrientos regime to the core, whereas Che's guerrilla activities, at least before the Arguedas affair, had the effect of strengthening the Barrientos regime and the Bolivian military. By calling into question the integrity of the government and the armed forces, Arguedas's actions weakened the Barrientos regime and the public's confidence in the existing political system. Moreover, Arguedas's return to Bolivia and his revelations about the nature of the CIA's interference in Bolivian affairs called into question the role of the United States government and companies in that country. In fact, the Arguedas affair provides shocking evidence about the nature of the U.S. government's involvement in the domestic affairs of Latin American countries. Following his press conference in the Ministry of the Interior the day of his return to Bolivia, Arguedas was placed in strict confinement and not allowed to make any further statements to the press. However, within a few months, he was released from prison as a result of the Bolivian High Court's decision that it did not have the authority to try him. According to the High Court, the Bolivian legislature was the only body competent to try a former minister of state for acts of treason committed while in office. Because of the court's decision, Arguedas was released from prison pending action by the legislature. He kept a low profile after his release, but within a short time, several attempts were made on his life. Twice bombs were thrown at him, and on June 6, 1969, he and a Spanish journalist accompanying him were machine-gunned while walking on the street in La Paz. Both Arguedas and the journalist escaped with minor wounds. However, Arguedas was hospitalized for almost a month, and immediately following his release from the hospital, he sought asylum in the Mexican embassy. In a statement he gave to the press at the time, he explained that his intentions were to leave Bolivia and go to Mexico. He said that he had decided to leave Bolivia because of the increasing political instability in the country following the death of President Barrientos, who was killed when his personal helicopter crashed in mysterious circumstances, and because of the recent attempts on his life. He gave as an additional reason the failure of the government to take any action whatsoever against Che's diary, and hidden remains 183 the agents of U.S. imperialism who were at work undermining Bolivia's national sovereignty. During this time, Arguedas was the author of yet another incredible episode. He secretly arranged for Che's hands in a glass container of formaldehyde and a plaster mask of his face, made in Villegrande, to be sent to Cuba in much the same manner as he had arranged for the copies of Che's diary to be sent there. However, in this case, the existence and transfer of these items to Cuba were not discovered until many years later. In fact, to this day, the story of Che's hands and his death mask is not widely known. Che's hands and death mask, the odyssey of these two items, is more complex, and more difficult to follow than the story of Che's diary. The man who cut off Che's hands and made his death mask out of plaster was Roberto Todo Quintanilla, an official in Arguedes's ministry. Like many of the other figures associated with Che's death, he was killed under unusual circumstances in November 1970. An unknown woman gunned him down with an automatic weapon in his office in Hamburg, Germany, where he was serving as the Bolivian consul. Nothing more is known about him than this. According to Arguedes, Che's hands and his death mask were given to him by General Ovando after they had been inspected by the team of Argentine criminal investigators sent to Bolivia to verify Che's fingerprints. General Ovando instructed Arguedes to dispose of both items immediately and to leave no traces of them. However, Arguedes chose to ignore Ovando's orders and gave them for safekeeping to a close friend named Jorge Suarez, a Bolivian writer and the editor of the daily newspaper Jornada. In a little-known interview that Suarez gave Argentine journalist Uki Goni in 1995, Suarez claimed Arguedes asked him to come to his office 7 or 8 days after Che's death. Arguedes told him he wanted to discuss something very personal and urgent. When Suarez went to his office, Arguedes produced a glass container and a translucent bag. The contents of both Suarez could not at first see clearly. After 184 CheGuevara Arguedes motioned for him to come closer and examine the two objects. Suarez saw two hands floating in the glass container, and he saw a white plaster mask in the bag. As he studied the mask closely, he saw that it was an extraordinarily good replica of Che's face with his eyes open. He could even see the details of his beard. It did not appear to be the face of someone dead, rather of someone very much alive. Suarez told Goni he would never forget that face. Goni, 1995. Arguedes explained to Suarez that General Ovando had given him strict instructions to incinerate the hands and the mask, and then scatter the ashes in a river, but that he had decided not to follow these orders. He asked Suarez to take the items with him and hide them in his home. Although he was shocked and frightened, Suarez agreed to do what his friend asked him. According to Suarez, Arguedes said he was an admirer of Che and that the top levels of the Bolivian military and the U.S. Embassy, as well as certain other influential people, did not trust him. In fact, he said the U.S. Embassy suspected him of being a revolutionary and a possible contact for the guerrillas. By not destroying the death mask and Che's hands, Arguedes said that he was risking his life. Suarez made a sort of sarcophagus, or stone coffin, for the items under the floor of his bedroom and hid them there. Although his house was searched several times by the Bolivian secret police while Arguedes was in prison, Che's hands and death mask were not discovered. They stayed under the floor in his bedroom until Suarez left Bolivia in 1969 as the new ambassador to Mexico, appointed by the military government of none other than General Ovando. Suarez told Goni, 1995, that the Bolivian intelligence services and the CIA concluded afterward that he had probably carried Che's hands and death mask out of the country in his diplomatic pouch, so they discontinued looking for them. However, he had left them hidden under the floor of his bedroom. Meanwhile, following his release from prison, Arguedes sought refuge in the Mexican embassy, while his request for political exile to Mexico was under consideration. When he learned that Suarez was leaving the country for Mexico, he made arrangements to have Che's hands and death mask taken to Cuba in much the same way he had arranged for Che's diary to be taken. In July 1969, he asked his journalist friend Victor Zanier to arrange for the two items to be sent to Cuba. Zanier, in turn, delegated the mission to Jorge Satori and Juan Coronel. Although Che's diary and hidden remains 185, they were members of the pro-Soviet Bolivian Communist Party. Zanier felt they could be trusted, and he figured they could use the party's international connections to get out of the country and travel to Cuba. Juan Coronel kept the glass container with Che's hands and the bag with his death mask wrapped up in old newspapers under his bed for 5 months, while he and Satori made their arrangements to go to Cuba by way of Europe and the Soviet Union. Coronel was struck by how much the death mask revealed Che's features, and he described the glass container as cylindrical, about 10 inches high and 7 inches wide, and sealed with red wax. Inside were two hands floating in a brownish liquid. They appeared to have belonged to someone who had been quite strong. He said they were covered in a beautiful phi LM, most likely the ink used to record Che's phying gerprints, and they appeared to have been amputated with an inadequate instrument that left an irregular cut just before the wrists. Coronel's description of the way the hands were amputated matches the image in the shocking photographs of Che's hands that were taken by the Argentine criminal investigators, who were sent to Bolivia to prove that the Bolivian military had indeed captured and killed the famous Che Guevara. Their story and the photos they took were not released until many years later, DeCarlo's 2006. In their photographs, Che's hands are seen palm up on a newspaper page, with the curled fingers covered in ink and the ink bottle and pad next to them. Arguedes's Odyssey, the Mexican embassy arranged for Arguedes to leave Bolivia and go to Mexico in 1969, where I met him briefly at a conference in Cuernavaca. He appeared to be quite happy in Mexico. However, he subsequently left Mexico for Cuba, where he was celebrated for his actions, Anderson 1997, 745, and lived for 9 years. While he was living in Havana, he was visited several times by Antonio Perito, Estelano 2000, the oldest brother of Coco and Intai. Perito is a well-known Bolivian journalist, political activist, and university professor. According to Perito, Arguedes lived a very disciplined and studious existence while he was in Cuba, and he regularly spent his days doing research in the libraries. 186 CheGuevara in 1979, Arguedes returned to Bolivia and disappeared from public view. In the mid-1980s, his name appeared again in the press because he was accused of being involved in an armed group that kidnapped a wealthy businessman. Although his involvement in this affair was never proved conclusively, he was arrested and remained in prison from 1986 to 1989. After his release, he dropped out of sight again and did not surface until 1997, the year the search for Che's remains in Bolivia reached a crescendo and became a highly publicized international effort. During this period, the media and some of the people involved in the search for Che's remains tried to locate Arguedes to see if he could tell them where Che's body had been buried. However, the police found Arguedes' arrestee and arrested him for supposedly leading a gang that was planning to kidnap businessmen in order to extract ransom money from their families and business associates. He was released by the police while awaiting trial, and he immediately went into hiding. Subsequently, he was declared a fugitive from justice when he failed to appear in court on the date of his trial. During this time, he told Antonio Perito that he had in his passes the names of everyone involved in the drug trade in Bolivia, and that many people knew this. For this reason, he told Perito, "I'm a dangerous man, Estelano 2000. By this time, the Bolivian police were trying to link him to a series of bombings in La Paz. They arrested 3 men who they said belonged to a terrorist group that was led by Arguedes, but they were unable to present any serious proof that he was involved in this group. Between November 20 and December 16, 1999, there were 6 bombings in random locations around La Paz that made no sense and that were never explained by the police. The police accused Antonio Arguedes of being responsible for the bombings and for the deaths of several people who were killed by the bombings. He did not turn himself into the authorities and remained in hiding. In February 2000, the police reported that he was killed in La Paz when a bomb he was carrying exploded. The police said he belonged to a right-wing group called C4, which had declared war against Castroism, drugs, and corruption in Bolivia. But Arguedes's family members and local political observers expressed serious doubts about the police account of his death, Estelano 2000. It remains unclear whether his death was Che's diary, and hidden remains 187 accidental or intentional. One newspaper account suggested that the police explanation of Arguedes's death provided an ironic metaphor for his zigzagging political life. According to this account, instead of moving the timer on the bomb to the right to start its timing sequence, he moved it to the contact point on the left, and it instantly blew up in his hands. Clarin. Com 2000. Of course, it is more likely he was killed by the police. The true story of his death may never be known. Che's body as for Che's body. After it was displayed in Velegrand, it disappeared from public view and became a state secret, since the Bolivian military refused to give any information to the public about this subject. There was considerable speculation about what happened to it. Some people believed the CIA had taken Che's body back to the United States, others that his body had been cremated and his ashes spread over the jungle by air, and some thought he was buried in a secret location. It now appears that the CIA agent Gustavo Villoldo was responsible for burying Che's body in an unmarked grave near the Velegrand airport, along with 6 of Che's former companions in arms. At least this is where his bones were ultimately uncovered, 30 years after his death, and following an almost 2-year search. In July 1997, a team of Cuban and Argentine experts found his remains with those of 6 of his comrades in an unmarked grave at the edge of the Velegrand airport. The Cuban-Argentine team conclusively identified one of the skeletons as being Che's remains on the basis of its facial bone structure, teeth, and absence of hands, rather 1997. It also was found with a jacket and was not wearing socks, consistent with the last photographs taken of Che after he was killed, which show him lying on a jacket and without socks. The search for and discovery of Che's remains in Bolivia adds yet another page to the remarkable story of his life and death, and reveals that his legacy continues to take on new dimensions as time passes. On November 26, 1995, the New York Times published an article containing statements of retired Bolivian Army General Mario Vargas Salinas to the effect that Che's body had been buried under the landing strip at the 188 CheGuevara Velegrand Airport. Castaneda 1997, 445. In fact, the widow of Colonel Andrés Selig told the journalist John Lee Anderson, who was collecting information for his biographical book on Che Guevara, that her husband and a couple of other Bolivian army officers, including Vargas, had buried Che's body and the bodies of 6 of his comrades in 2 unmarked graves dug by a bulldozer near the Velegrand airport. Anderson 1997, 742. When Anderson questioned Vargas, who wrote a book in 1988 about Che's Bolivian operation, he told Anderson that all the bodies had been buried in one unmarked grave near the edge of the airport. The reporting of these details of Che's death, especially in the New York Times by Thomas Lipscomb, November 26, 1995-3, caused a political uproar in Bolivia. It also stirred a great deal of interest in the international media and gave rise to a flood of new information about Che's death and his fatal Bolivian mission. Under pressure from the national and the international press, the president of Bolivia ordered the army to recover the bodies of Che and his comrades. What followed was a rather bizarre and highly publicized search for their bodies by an odd assortment of Bolivians, Cubans, and Argentines, which attracted many onlookers and reporters. Anderson 1997, Roman 15. The whole affair turned out to be a source of considerable embarrassment for the Bolivian government and military, since it resurrected a controversial chapter in Bolivia's political history. For his part in the whole affair, Vargas was placed under house arrest for revealing state secrets. The little town of Velegrand, with a population of approximately 8,000 people, was in the news again, but this time because of the présence of Cuban forensic anthropologists and geologists. At FIRST, they located the remains of only 5 of the guerrillas, a fraction of the 32 guerrillas who were killed in the area and buried in unmarked graves. But for 16 months, there was no sign of Che's body. Meanwhile, Velegrand's municipal government leaders declared Che's remains were a national patrimony and imposed a moratorium on the search until mid-June 1997. Someone in the town also started promoting a $70 per day walking tour of the route taken by Che and his comrades before they were caught and killed, and there was talk of creating a museum. Loyola Guzman, who had been the treasurer of the clan's Tyne urban network that supported Che's guerrilla force before she and Che's diary, and hidden remains 189, the others were arrested and imprisoned by the Bolivian authorities, stated publicly that Che's remains should rightfully remain in Bolivian soil. She argued that his life was an example of heroic internationalism that no single country should monopolize. Following her release from prison, Guzman returned to leftist activism and was very much involved in the campaign for the defense of human rights in Bolivia. In 2006, she was elected to the Constituent Assembly in Bolivia as one of the representatives of the Movimiento al Socialismo, MAS, or Movement Toward Socialism. In Che's diary, he noted that Loyola made a very good impression on me. She is very young and sweet, but one notes a strong determination. The discovery of Che's body, the Cuban team met until 4 a.m. on June 28, 1997, before they decided where to focus their day of digging. According to Alejandro Inchorrigui, one of a team of Argentine forensic anthropologists who were called in to help the Cubans, Tamayo, 1997. Ground radar surveys made by the Cuban-Argentine search team earlier in 1997 had discovered a dozen spots of disturbed earth that they thought could be grave sites. 3 of these sites appeared to be human-made, and they decided to concentrate on these sites using a bulldozer, not the preferred tool of forensic specialists. However, time was running out for the Cuban-Argentine team of experts because of changing political circumstances in Bolivia. They set the blade of the bulldozer to remove 4 inches of dirt with each pass of the blade. They found nothing at the Phi Resti site, but at the second site, after 18 passes, the bulldozer blade uncovered the remains of a human skeleton. As they continued to dig, they found the remains of a total of 7 bodies in 2 groups, separated by 2.5 feet. The bodies were buried in a pit between the edge of Vallegrande's old dirt airstrip and a nearby cemetery. The searchers were overcome with emotion when they examined the remains of the second body that was in the middle of the Phi Resti group of 3 skeletons. The skeleton had no hands, since they knew Che's hands had been amputated after his death. They were almost certain they had finally found his remains. The American author John Lee Anderson was present during the digging on this day, 190 CheGuevara, and according to Anderson, just seeing the genuine excitement, the genuine euphoria on the face of the Cubans there made me certain this was Che's remains. They were simply overcome, crying and hugging each other. Tamayo, 1997. However, they still had to prove to the Bolivian government that the remains were those of Che and obtain permission to send them to Cuba. According to the Argentine forensic anthropologist Inchorrigui, the Bolivian Ministry of Interior officials had warned them they needed to move fast, since the inauguration of Bolivia's newly elected right-wing president and former military dictator, Hugo Banzer, was rapidly approaching, and they assumed he would likely block the removal of Che's remains. Thus, on the night of July 5, 1997, a convoy of vehicles with the remains of the guerrillas made the 150-mile trip at full speed along the dangerous mountain roads between Vallegrande and the provincial capital of Santa Cruz. In Santa Cruz, Che's remains were quickly identified. The team of examiners was composed of experts from the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Havana, the director of Che's personal archive, Maria del Carmen Ariet, and the Argentine forensic anthropologists. They matched the evidence of bullet wounds in the bones of skeleton 2 with the historical facts of Che's death. The excavated teeth of skeleton 2 matched a plausible mold of Che's teeth made in Cuba before he left for the Congo. The mold had been made in the event he died in combat, and his body had to be identified. Moreover, there was other evidence to support the conclusion that the remains were indeed those of Che Guevara. For example, retired Bolivian Air Force General Jaime Nino de Guzman, the helicopter pilot who flew Che's body and the bodies of the other guerrillas killed in or near La Higuera to Vallegrande, spoke with Che in La Higuera shortly before he was killed. He recalled that Che was shot in his right calf. His hair was matted and dirty, his clothes were shredded, and his feet were shod in rough handmade sandals. According to General Nino de Guzman, Che kept his head high, looked everyone in the eye, and asked only for something to smoke. The general told a reporter, "I took pity since he looked so terrible and gave him my small bag of imported tobacco for his pipe. He smiled and thanked me." Tamayo, 1997. When the Argentine anthropologist Inchorrigui inspected the jacket dug up next to Che's remains, he found a small bag of Che's diary and hidden remains 191 pipe tobacco in the inside pocket that had apparently been missed by the soldiers who searched Che's body after he was killed in La Higuera. General Nino de Guzman acknowledged that this was irrefutable evidence. The remains were indeed cheese. He told a reporter, "I must tell you I had serious doubts at the beginning. I thought the Cubans would just find any old bones and call it cheese. But after hearing about the tobacco pouch, I have no doubts." Tamayo 1997. The Bolivian government gave the Cubans permission to take cheese remains to Cuba, along with those of all the other guerrillas who were found buried in unmarked graves in Bolivia, including the bones of Tania, Heyday Tamara Bunk, the only woman in cheese guerrilla force, and Joaquin, Comandante Juan Vitalio Acuña Núñez, cheese Cuban comrade, and the second in command of the guerrilla force. Thus, on October 11, 1997, almost exactly 30 years after Che's death, his remains and those of the other 6 fallen comrades found buried with him were placed on display in FL ag-draped caskets inside the monument to José Martí in Havana. Los Angeles Times, October 12, 1997, A1. With a huge 50-foot mural of Che overlooking the Plaza de la Revolución, hundreds of thousands of Cubans waited in line to pay their respects. After 7 days of a facile mourning and national homage to Che's life and ideals, the caskets were taken to the city of Santa Clara, where Che had led the guerrilla column that scored a decisive victory in the Cuban Revolution. In Santa Clara, Che's coffee N was placed in a newly constructed mausoleum at the base of a large statue of him holding a rifle E in his hand. At the quasi-religious ceremony held in Santa Clara, and in the prise en scène of Che's widow, Aleida March, their 2 daughters and their 2 sons, Fidel Castro praised Che's qualities as the ideal revolutionary. He closed his homage to Che before the assembled crowd with the following words: "Thank you, Che, for your history, your life, and your example. Thank you for coming to reinforce us in the difficult struggle in which we are engaged today to preserve the ideas for which you fought so hard." Rather, 1997. In the midst of this massive public veneration of Che, his daughter Aleida Guevara, who is a doctor like her father, told a press conference that her father always shunned public adulation when he was an important public figure in Cuba, and that he probably would have been embarrassed by all the celebrations in his honor. She also said that it hurt to see 192 CheGuevara, the image of her father marketed for commercial purposes on ashtrays, beer, and jeans, but that she hoped some young people would see beyond this commercialism and search for the ideals that her father stood for, ease peacefully in a globalized society that is losing all its values. Feynman, 1997. Like his older sister, Che's son Camilo Guevara, a lawyer in the Cuban Ministry of Fisheries, is protective of his father's memory and image. He also has criticized what he characterizes as the bad intentions of some of the authors of the books published about his father. Interestingly, in many of the articles published by U.S. newspapers on the return of Che's remains to Cuba and the celebrations that were held in his honor, the reporters used the opportunity to criticize Cuba's socialist system and Che Guevara's ideas on revolution. They characterized them as anachronistic and no longer relevant in the contemporary period. However, the defeat of Che's guerrilla operation in Bolivia does not indicate that an armed revolution is impossible in Latin America. As long as the existing political and economic elites in the region continue to postpone badly needed social and economic reforms, and the gap between the rich and the poor continues to increase, popular insurrection will remain on the agenda in Latin America and in other parts of the world with similar conditions. Moreover, the use of repressive and undemocratic measures by those in power to block peaceful and legal efforts to bring about basic economic, political, and social reforms invariably provokes the use of non-peaceful and extralegal means by those who see they have no other options if they want to create a more just social order.
Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe,